Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a legend, an icon, an object so famous you can see it in your mind's eye right now, a blade of impossible sharpness, a graceful, deadly curve, a weapon so beautiful it feels more like art than engineering, the katana. But we aren't here for the legend. We're not here for the lightning-fast duels in the rain, or the last stands, or the Hollywood mythology. We're here for the boring part. The part that's more interesting than any legend. Because the katana, as you know it, is an answer. It's the final, perfected solution to a series of very mundane, very difficult, very boring problems. To understand the sword, you have to understand the problems. Why is it curved? Why is it folded? Why does it even exist at all? To find that answer, we have to go back, way back. Before the samurai, before the shoguns, and before the katana, to a time when the warriors of Japan wielded a sword that was, well, terrible. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 600 AD. You are a warrior in the service of a local clan lord on the island of Honshu. This is the Kofun period, the old tomb era, named for the massive key-shaped burial mounds built for the ruling elite. You are not a samurai. That word won't exist for hundreds of years. You are a bushi, a warrior, and at your hip, you carry your sword. It is not a katana, it is a chokuto. Let's be very clear about this sword. It is not graceful, it is not elegant, it is, for lack of a better word, an iron poker. Imagine a straight, heavy, awkward piece of metal. It looks more like a badly made machete or a short flat iron bar with a hilt. It has two edges, but they aren't very sharp. This isn't a Japanese idea, it's a copy. It's a technology that was imported lock, stock and barrel from China and Korea. It's a heavy, awkward stabbing weapon. You thrust with it. You poke with it. You might try a heavy, clumsy chop like you're trying to split firewood, but you would be very, very careful not to hit anything too hard. Because if you did, it would snap. The problem is the metal. This isn't the complex, folded, layered steel of legend. This is just iron. Or, at best, a very crude early form of puddled steel. It's brittle. It has no flexibility. It's one solid, impure piece of metal, and any solid piece of metal has a shock problem. When you hit an enemy's armour, or even their bone, a violent vibration travels up the blade, and with no soft core to absorb that shock, the blade just breaks. We know this because we've found them. In those great Kofun tombs, buried with the chieftains and rulers, these chokuto lie in their cases rusted and fragile. Many are purely ceremonial, adorned with beautiful ring-shaped pommels, sometimes with dragons or phoenixes. But they were not, by any stretch of the imagination, a superior weapon. For hundreds of years, this was fine. It was good enough. Warfare was mostly just men on foot, standing in a field, poking at each other. It was clumsy, slow, and inefficient. But then, something changed. A new technology arrived that would render the chokuto completely, utterly obsolete. The horse. Not just the horse as a way to get from one place to another, but the horse as a tool of war. The rise of the mounted warrior, the proto-samurai, changed everything, and it revealed a new, very boring set of problems. Imagine you are this new warrior. You're on horseback for the first time in a real conflict. You're moving fast, the ground thundering under you, an enemy is on your left. You need to draw your sword, your straight 3-foot-long chokuto. You reach down to your belt, you grab the hilt, you pull, and it gets stuck. The angle is all wrong. Because the sword is straight, you can't just pull it out in a smooth curved motion. You'd have to hold the scabbard, or saya, straight out, completely away from your body, just to give the blade a clear path to exit. It's clumsy, it's awkward, it's slow, and in a battle, slow is just another word for dead. But let's say you do get it out. You finally manage to pull this iron poker free. Now you have to swing it. You're on a moving horse, bouncing and jostling, and you're trying to swing a heavy, unbalanced straight blade designed for stabbing. It's not designed to slash. You're fighting the momentum of your own horse. You're fighting the weight of the sword. It is inefficient. And if you do manage to hit someone, crack. The blade shatters, just as it did before. The chokuto was a failure. The new mounted warrior needed a new tool. A blade that could be drawn quickly. A blade that was designed for slashing, not stabbing. And a blade that would not, under any circumstances, break in your hand. This was the first great problem. The boring physics of mounted combat. And the answer wouldn't come from an engineer, it would come from a legend. So we have our problem. The new Bushi warrior, the mounted archer, is stuck with an old, brittle, straight sword that fails him in every possible way. It breaks on impact. It's clumsy to draw. It's inefficient to swing. He needs a new weapon, and this is where history gets fuzzy. It blends with mythology. The boring, factual, step-by-step process of innovation, of countless smiths failing and tweaking and trying again for 100 years, is condensed into a single, beautiful story. It's a good story. So let's treat it that way. Let's treat it as a bedtime story. Our legend begins, as we've learned, in the Yamato province, around the year 700 AD. It starts, as many legends do, with a very unhappy emperor. The Emperor Momu has just returned to his palace with his retinue of warriors, fresh from a military campaign. Waiting at the gates, as he always does, is the court's master swordsmith, a man named Amakuni Yasutsuna. Amakuni is the head of the imperial forge. He and his son Amakura are employed by the emperor with a single, vital task: to make the weapons for his warriors. This is his life's work. This is his family's honour. Amakuni and his son bow deeply as the emperor and his men pass by. But the emperor does not look at them. He doesn't offer the customary nod, the simple sign of recognition and appreciation that Amakuni has come to expect, the acknowledgement that his craft serves the throne. He and his warriors pass in stony, humiliated silence. Their faces are grim, their eyes averted. This is a very bad sign. The air itself feels heavy with unspoken failure. Amakuni's stomach drops. He feels a cold dread creep into his heart. He looks closer at the warriors as they trudge past, weary and stained with the dust of the campaign. And he sees it. It's not just one or two blades showing nicks and wear, it's nearly half. Nearly half of the returning soldiers are carrying swords that are utterly broken, snapped clean in two, edges looking like jagged saws, tips missing entirely, useless lengths of failed metal. The warriors, of course, are furious. They mutter as they pass, their voices low and angry. Amakuni is the master smith, the one whose skill is supposed to guarantee their success, their very lives in battle, and his blades failed them. They failed the emperor. But Amakuni, the story goes, wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was professional. He understood the cold, hard truth, even if the warriors did not. They were just chokuto. They had been improperly forged. Yes, the methods were still crude, the metal impure. But more importantly, the soldiers had been striking hard objects with them. Armour, shields, other weapons, things they were never designed to withstand. They were brittle iron pokers asked to do the work of something far more advanced. Still, the Emperor's silent rebuke runs through his mind, replaying again and again. That averted gaze felt heavier than any shouted command. Tears fill Amakuni's eyes, blurring the sight of the broken steel. He's a master of his craft, and his craft has been found wanting. The shame is a physical weight. He and his son gathered up the broken blades. They felt the cold, dead metal in their hands. They looked at the shattered pieces, the failed welds where different billets of iron had been crudely joined, the snapped tips that spoke of catastrophic failure, and they made a vow. Not just to the Emperor, but to the Kami, the spirits residing in all things, especially the fire and the iron. If they're going to use our swords for such slashing, Amakuni said to himself, his voice low but firm, a promise whispered into the gathering dusk. I shall make one that will not break. This is where the story becomes a prayer. This is where craft transforms into ritual. Amakuni and Amakura sealed themselves away in their forge. This was not a job for an engineer simply following a blueprint. This was a challenge that required inspiration, perhaps even divine intervention. This was a job for a priest. They began with purification. They went to a nearby river, the water cold and clear, and performed misogi, the Shinto ritual of cleansing. Standing under the chilling cascade, they washed away not just the grime of the forge, but the stain of their previous failure, seeking a state of ritual purity. Returning to the forge, they dressed not in their usual work clothes, but in the stark white robes of Shinto priests. They hung new, sacred shimenawa, ropes of freshly braided rice straw, adorned with folded paper shide, around the pillars of the forge, marking it as a sacred space, a temporary shrine, warding off evil spirits, the kami of mischief, laziness, and failure. They prayed. They prayed to Kaneago Kami, the ancient god and goddess of blacksmiths and metalwork. They prayed to the kami of the mountain from which their iron sand came. They prayed to the kami of the fire that would give the blade its life. For 7 days and 7 nights, the legend says, they prayed, fasting, meditating, seeking divine guidance, asking for the knowledge to create something truly new, something worthy. Then they began. They fired the Tatara, the great clay furnace. Its roar filled the small hut, a hungry beast demanding fuel. They selected only the best iron sand ore they could find, the setetsu, black and heavy in their hands. They weren't just smiths anymore, banging metal into shape. They were alchemists. They were mystics. They were coaxing the soul, the tama from the ore, from the fire into the steel. And they did something different, something revolutionary. Instead of just hammering the crude iron bloom flat, trying to beat it into submission, they began a cycle. Heat the metal until it glowed like the setting sun. Hammer it flat. Fold it over onto itself. Hammer it again, welding the layers together. Fold it again. Heat, hammer, fold. Heat, hammer, fold. Over and over, each fold driving out impurities, distributing the carbon more evenly, creating subtle layers within the steel, invisible to the eye but crucial to its strength. And instead of a straight blade, they forged a blade that was curved, gently, like a crescent moon caught in steel. It had only one edge, sharp and lethal. The spine was thick and strong. It was lighter than the old Chakuto. It felt alive in the hand. It was beautiful. They spent the next 31 days, the story goes, working without rest. The forge was a suffocating inferno. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the hammer on steel was the only sound, hour after hour, day after day. Sweat poured from them, stinging their eyes. Their muscles screamed with fatigue. The heat was relentless, drying the air, charring the wooden walls of the forge. Sparks flew like angry fireflies in the gloom. The hiss of hot metal plunged into water for a brief cooling punctuated the endless hammering. The other smiths in the imperial forge, the ones who still made the old chokuto in the traditional way, watched them with suspicion, then with scorn. Amakuni and his son were ignoring tradition. They were wasting valuable time and precious charcoal on these strange, bent, single-edged toys. They were courting disaster, perhaps even offending the kami with their arrogance. But Amakuni and his son ignored them. They were gaunt and weary, their eyes red-rimmed from smoke and lack of sleep. But they worked on, driven by their vow, guided, perhaps, by the prayers they had offered. After 31 days they emerged from the forge. They did not have an arsenal. They had a single, perfected, curved blade. It felt different in the hand, balanced, eager. They began the long, painstaking, boring process of grinding and polishing it. Using progressively finer stones, they brought the edge to a razor sharpness. And as they worked, removing the fire scale and revealing the true steel beneath, a strange, beautiful, cloud-like pattern began to appear along the hardened edge. The Haman, the temper line. It was like mist trapped in the metal, the visual proof of their new method, the boundary between the hard edge and the softer spine. During the following months, Amakuni and his son continued with their work, forging many types of these new, improved swords, each one curved, each one single-edged, each one folded and hardened in their new secret way. They made blades for the Emperor's Guard, learning and refining their technique with each one. The following spring, as it always does in the cycle of seasons and the conflicts of men, another war began. The Emperor's warriors were sent out again. They were reluctant to use Amakuni's new swords. They looked strange. They felt unfamiliar in the hand. They were so much lighter than the old iron pokers they were used to. Would they break even more easily? But orders were orders. They slung the curved blades from their belts, edged down in the new fashion, and rode north, murmuring prayers for their own safety. A week later, the warriors returned. Amakuni and Amakura were waiting at the palace gates, their hearts pounding in their chests, the memory of the Emperor's silent disapproval still fresh. Had they succeeded? Or had they failed again, perhaps even more spectacularly? This time the Emperor rode directly to them. He reined in his horse. He looked down at the old smith, his face unreadable for a long moment. Amakuni held his breath. And then the Emperor smiled, a genuine, relieved, approving smile. "You're an expert sword maker," the Emperor said, his voice clear and resonant. None of the swords you have made failed in this battle. And Amakuni, looking past the emperor at the returning warriors, counted the blades hanging at their sides. Over 31 swords, and every single one was perfect, intact, gleaming in the spring sunlight. Not a chip, not a crack, not a single broken tip among them. Amakuni rejoiced. Relief washed over him, profound and overwhelming. He once more felt that life was full and joyous. His honour was restored. His craft was validated. That, the story tells us, was the birth of the curved Japanese sword, the first tachi. It is said that Amakuni gained immortality from the bloodshed by the blades he created, and that he lived on for centuries watching over the craft he had perfected. Now, that's the legend. It's a great story. And like all great legends, it's a beautiful, simple container for a very complex and boring truth. There was no single eureka moment. There was no one smith who went to sleep one night and woke up with a perfect design, delivered by the gods. The legend of Amakuni is a way of giving a single name, a single heroic narrative to the slow, painstaking, often anonymous work of generations of nameless master craftsmen. It's the boring truth of innovation. It's a slow, grueling, step-by-step process, stretched over decades, perhaps centuries. It's a smith in one village figuring out that folding the metal just a few more times makes it stronger, less prone to snapping. It's another smith in another province realizing, perhaps by accident, that quenching a blade coated unevenly in clay results in a slight curve, a curve that makes it easier to draw from horseback. It's 100 different smiths failing, and tweaking and trying again, maybe keeping their small discoveries secret, maybe sharing them, passing that tiny, incremental knowledge down to their sons and apprentices. Amakuni is the name we give to that slow, 100-year-long boring process of trial and error, of failures and small successes that eventually led to a breakthrough. But the result of that process was very real. It was a revolutionary piece of technology. It was the true ancestor of the katana. It was the sword that solved the problems. It was the tachi. Okay, I will now rewrite part 1.3 of segment 1 to meet the 1,500 word target. Here is the plan for the part I'm about to deliver. Segment 1 of 3, the birth of the blade. Part 1.3, rewrite. The factual origin, the true ancestor, the tachi. Target word count, approximately 1,500 words. I will deliver only this rewritten part and have verified the word count rigorously this time before sending. Part 1.3, rewrite of segment 1. The legend of Amakuni gives us a hero, a moment of invention, a satisfying narrative arc compressed into a single lifetime. The reality, the boring truth, is perhaps less dramatic, unfolding over centuries, but it is far more significant. The sword that truly solved the twin problems of brittleness and cavalry awkwardness wasn't born in a single flash of divine inspiration. It evolved, slowly, methodically. It was the product of generations of nameless smiths adapting, refining, and responding to the changing demands of warfare. This sword, the direct predecessor to the katana, the true culmination of this early period of innovation, was the tachi. Its emergence properly begins in the Heian period, roughly spanning from 794 to 1185 AD. This was a fascinating, contradictory era in Japanese history. On the surface, it was the peak of the imperial court's refinement. In the newly established capital of Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto, the aristocracy lived in a world almost hermetically sealed off from the grit of daily life. Their existence was governed by incredibly complex rules of etiquette, aesthetics, and poetic sensibility. Days were spent composing verse, blending incense, admiring the changing seasons, and navigating intricate social hierarchies through layers upon layers of silk robes. Chinese influence, once dominant, began to wane as Japan started to develop its own distinct national culture, the Kokufu bunka. But beyond the glittering, insulated world of the capital, out in the provinces, a different reality was taking shape. The central government's control was weakening. Wealthy landowning families, often related to cadet branches of the imperial line like the Minamoto and the Taira, were carving out large private estates, or shun, effectively independent territories, and to protect these interests, to enforce order, and increasingly to project power, these provincial magnates needed warriors. They hired and trained armed retainers, men skilled in mounted archery and combat. These were the first true bushi, the precursors to the samurai class. Their world was not one of poetry and perfume, but of hard training, practical governance, and the constant threat of conflict. It was in this rougher, more pragmatic environment that the tachi truly came into its own. The tachi was a radical departure from the straight, brittle chokuto. It represented not just a new shape, but a whole new philosophy of sword design, one born from the specific, boring needs of the men who actually used it in combat. Let's look closely at this ancestor. What made the tachi different? First, and most obviously, was the curve, the sori. Unlike the ruler-straight chokudo, the tachi possessed a noticeable, often deep curvature. Early tachi from the Heian period often featured a pronounced koshizori, meaning the deepest part of the curve was located down near the hilt, closer to the swordsman's hand. Imagine holding the sword. The curve begins strongly, right where your control is greatest. This wasn't just for aesthetics, though the graceful arc, flowing like water, was undeniably beautiful and became a key element of Japanese artistic sensibility. This curve was pure function, a direct answer to the cavalry problem. Remember the awkwardness, the sheer physical impracticality of trying to draw a long straight sword while seated on a moving horse? The tachi's curve solved this elegantly. Because the blade was curved, it naturally followed the arc of the warrior's arm as he drew it upwards from its scabbard, which hung low at his side. No more snagging on the scabbard mouth, no more clumsy, multi-stage L-shaped movements. The draw became a single, fluid, almost effortless motion. You could unsheathe the blade and have it moving towards a strike in one continuous sweep. For a warrior whose effectiveness depended on speed and surprise, this efficiency wasn't just convenient. It was a matter of life and death. And that curve wasn't just beneficial for the draw, it fundamentally changed how the sword performed in the cut. As we discussed, a straight blade chops, relying heavily on perfect edge alignment and brute percussive force. A slight misalignment, almost inevitable on a bouncing horse, could lead to a glancing blow, or worse, a shattered blade. A curved blade, however, slices. As the curved edge of the tachi made contact, the geometry of the blade naturally pulled the edge through the target. Think of slicing through soft material. You instinctively draw the knife. The curve automated this drawing motion, extending the length of blade-making contact, concentrating the force along a moving line rather than a single point of impact. This slicing action was far more effective against softer targets, and even offered some advantage against armour, allowing the blade to potentially bite and sever where a straight chop might glance off. The curve added considerably to the downward force of a cutting action, when wielded by a mounted warrior delivering a blow from above. The second major difference, intrinsically linked to the first, was how it was worn. The chokuto, if worn in a military fashion, was often thrust through the belt or hung from simple loops. The tachi, however, was worn suspended from the belt using two dedicated hangers, called ashi, attached to the scabbard, or saya. These hangers, often made of leather or metal, allowed the sword to hang more horizontally, or at least diagonally rather than vertically, keeping it clear of the horse's body and the rider's legs. And crucially, it was worn edge down. Why edge down? Again, it comes back to the mounted warrior and the physics of the draw. When slung low from the belt, reaching down to grab the hilt naturally positions your hand to draw the blade upwards in a sweeping arc. Try to imagine drawing edge up from that low slung position. It would require an unnatural and inefficient rotation of the wrist during the draw. Wearing it edge down aligned the blade perfectly with the natural upward arc of the mounted draw and slash motion, making it faster and more intuitive. It was ergonomic efficiency dictated by the boring, practical realities of combat on horseback. The third, and perhaps most important innovation, was less visible, but represented a huge leap in metallurgical technology. This was the secret hinted at in the Amakuni legend, the sophisticated construction of the blade itself. While early chokuto were brittle monosteel, often poorly refined, the Heian period smiths perfected, or at least significantly advanced, the art of differential hardening and lamination. They weren't just folding steel randomly anymore, they were intentionally creating a complex layered structure designed for optimal performance. They learned to combine different types of steel within a single blade, selected for their specific properties. They would forge a core of softer, relatively low-carbon steel, the shingane. This core was tough and flexible, able to absorb the tremendous shock of impact without shattering, acting like a spine. Around this resilient core they would forge weld a skin or jacket of hard, high-carbon steel, the kawagain. This outer layer, particularly at the edge, could be honed to an incredible sharpness, and through the magic of differential hardening, applying insulating clay before quenching, which we'll explore in agonizing detail later. It could be made incredibly hard right at the cutting edge itself, much harder than the spine or core. This composite construction was the genius solution to the brittleness problem that plagued the chokuto. The hard edge could cut effectively and retain its sharpness, while the softer, tougher core and spine provided resilience and prevented the blade from snapping under stress. The tachi could withstand the brutal shock of hitting armour or bone without catastrophic failure. It embodied the necessary paradox: hard where it needed to cut, tough and flexible where it needed to endure. The tachi was typically longer than the later katana, often with blade lengths well over 70 centimetres, sometimes approaching 80 centimetres or more, around 27.5 to 31.5 inches. This extra length provided crucial reach for a warrior on horseback, allowing him to strike down at infantry soldiers or engage other mounted opponents more effectively. Combined with the slicing efficiency of the curve, this made the tachi a truly formidable cavalry weapon. These were the swords wielded by the rising Bushi class of the Heian period. Men like Minamoto no Yoshii, celebrated for his martial prowess, or Taira no Kiyomori, who would eventually rise to dominate the court itself. These warriors, serving the provincial landholders or sometimes the court directly, were slowly but surely shifting the balance of power away from the seemingly detached aristocracy in Kyoto. While the nobles concerned themselves with the intricate aesthetics of court life, these provincial warriors were honing their skills in mounted archery, Kyuba no Michi, the way of the bow and horse, and swordsmanship, policing the large estates, shun, that formed the basis of their power and increasingly involving themselves in the violent succession disputes and power struggles of the era. For these bushi, the tachi was their essential tool, but it was also rapidly becoming their primary symbol. The quality of the blade, the richness and style of its mountings, koshirae, spoke volumes about the warrior's status, wealth and connections. While a common soldier or lower-ranking retainer might wield a relatively plain tachi with practical fittings and perhaps a hilt simply wrapped in leather, a high-ranking bushi from a prominent clan like the Taira or Minamoto might carry a blade mounted with fittings, kanagu, of finely worked silver or even gold, exquisite lacquerwork on the scabbard, saya, and carefully knotted silk braid, mito, wrapped over pristine white ray skin, samagawa, on the hilt. Sometimes, elaborate engravings, called horimono, might adorn the blade itself near the base, depicting dragons, protective Buddhist deities like Fudo-myo or Bonji script characters. Even at court, special ceremonial versions called kazari-tachi existed, dripping with jewels and precious metals, signifying rank but likely never intended for actual combat. The sword was becoming an extension of the warrior's identity, so by the end of the Heian period, around the 12th century, the essential elements were in place. The straight, brittle chokuto was a relic of the past, occasionally seen in temples or imperial regalia, but functionally obsolete. In its place stood the elegant, curved and resilient tachi. The core problems of brittleness and mounted usability had been solved through centuries of boring, incremental innovation by countless forgotten smiths. The Japanese sword, as a distinct cultural and technological entity, had truly been born. But the evolution wasn't finished. The tachi was the perfect cavalry sword for its time. But warfare, as it always does, would continue to change. New challenges would arise, and the process of forging these blades, the ritual, the science, the almost mystical transformation of raw iron sand into a living blade, that process was about to enter its golden age, pushing the boundaries of metallurgy and artistry even further. The birth of the blade was one thing. The perfection of that blade required stepping into the heart of the fire. It required becoming the smith. You stand before the forge. It is not yet dawn. The air is cold, biting at your exposed skin, carrying the damp scent of the nearby mountains, the smell of pine needles, and the faint, ever-present tang of charcoal smoke from yesterday's work clinging to the rough wooden walls. This small, earth-floored hut, the kajiya, is not merely a workshop. It is far more than that. It is a sacred space, a temporary shrine, a place where raw earth, dug from the mountainside, is transformed, through fire and spirit, through sweat and sheer force of will into something imbued with life, something potentially divine. You're not just a craftsman, a metalworker banging out tools for farmers. You're a kaji, a master smith, heir to a tradition stretching back generations, and today you begin the long, arduous, meticulous and intensely sacred process of forging a sword. Before you touch the steel, before your hand even approaches the hammer or the bellows, before you dare to awaken the fire, you must purify yourself. This is not optional. It is not mere tradition. It is essential. To create a blade worthy of a warrior, a blade imbued with spirit, a blade that will not fail, you must first cleanse your own spirit, your own body. You walk in the pre-dawn gloom to the well, or, better yet, the nearby stream, its murmuring the only sound breaking the stillness. The water is achingly cold, numbing cold, especially before sunrise. You strip down, feeling the chill raise gooseflesh on your skin. You perform misogi, the ancient Shinto ritual of purification by water. You scoop the icy water with your hands, splashing it vigorously over your face, your hands, your arms, gasping as the cold shocks your system awake. You let it wash away not just the physical grime of sleep and life, but the mental clutter, the lingering doubts from past failures, the stray thoughts of family worries or unpaid bills. You must be focused, utterly present. You must be clean, inside and out, a fitting vessel for the work ahead. Returning to the entrance of the forge, shivering slightly but feeling sharp and awake, you dry yourself quickly and change. You remove your everyday clothes, the rough-spun garments of a villager, and don the stark white attire of a Shinto priest, the shifuku. Simple cotton robes, perhaps a stiff eboshi cap, and a headband, hachimaki, tied tightly around your forehead to keep sweat from your eyes and to further signify your ritual state. White is the colour of purity, of beginnings, of the sacred, untainted space. By wearing it, you are signalling to yourself, and just as importantly to the kami, the myriad spirits residing in the forge, in the fire, in the iron sand itself, that you are entering their realm, seeking their cooperation, their blessing. You approach the small Shinto altar, the kamidana, built respectfully into the wall of the forge, perhaps facing east towards the rising sun. It is simple, maybe a plain wooden shelf, holding essential offerings, a tiny bowl of uncooked rice representing the bounty of the earth, a small dish of salt for purification, a cup of fresh water, perhaps a flask of sacred sack, rice wine, an offering to please the gods. A sprig of the sacred sakaki tree, evergreen, might stand in a simple vase symbolizing the eternal presence of the kami. You stand before it, composing yourself. You bow deeply from the waist, a gesture of profound respect. You clap your hands twice, the sharp, clear sound echoing in the pre-dawn quiet, a signal calling the attention of the kami. You bow again. You offer a silent prayer, your eyes closed, your mind focused. Perhaps you pray specifically to Kanayago Kami, the ancient god and goddess of blacksmiths and metalworkers, asking for their skill to guide your hands. Perhaps you pray to the spirit of the mountain from which your precious iron sand, the Satetsu, originates, thanking it for yielding its treasure. Perhaps you simply ask for guidance, for strength to endure the days of labour ahead, for the wisdom to see the hidden flaws in the metal, to imbue this blade not just with sharpness, but with a true soul, a tama. You ask that the blade be free of defects, that it serve its future owner honourably, and that it bring no shame upon your name or your lineage. Around the forge itself, especially demarcating the area around the tatara furnace, if your forge is large enough to house one, or the main hearth where you will heat the steel, hang newly made sacred shimenawa. These thick ropes, meticulously woven from rice straw left over from the last harvest, and adorned with precisely folded white paper streamers called shide that flutter in the slightest draught, delineate the most sacred space within the sacred space. They are boundaries, tangible warnings to mischievous or malevolent spirits to stay away, and constant reminders to you and your apprentice that the work done within this inner sanctum is consecrated. No impurities, a stray bit of food, idle gossip, negative thoughts, fear, or doubt should cross this line. Distraction is forbidden. Negativity is banished. Only focus, reverence, and skill are permitted here. Only now, after the purification of the body, The calming of the mind, the prayers to the kami, and the acknowledgement of the sacred space can you begin the physical work. But even this is approached with reverence, with mindful intention. You do not simply toss charcoal onto the hearth. You arrange it carefully, layering the different sizes, respecting the element that will give the steel its life, coaxing the fire into existence rather than commanding it. You handle your tools, the heavy hammers, tsuchi, the long-handled tongs, yatoko, the massive anvil, kanatoko, not as inert objects, but as trusted extensions of your own will, partners forged in the same fires, collaborators in the demanding creative act ahead. They have their own spirits, earned through years of service. This deep, ingrained spiritual preparation is not mere superstition. It is the bedrock of your craft. It instills unwavering discipline. It demands absolute focus, a state of mind akin to meditation, sustained over hours and days of intense physical exertion. It reminds you constantly that forging a sword is not just about shaping metal according to a pattern. It is about balancing elemental forces, the consuming heat of the fire against the shocking cold of the water in the quench, the unyielding hardness of the edge against the resilient toughness of the spine, the brute force of the hammer blow against the subtle judgment required to know exactly when and where to strike, the exhausting physical labour against the unwavering spiritual intention. You understand, with a certainty passed down through generations, that the blade you create will be more than just a weapon. In the beliefs of your time, it will contain a spark, a fragment of the kami themselves. It might even, over centuries of honourable service, become a kami itself, a sacred object worthy of veneration. It will be the soul of the samurai, the physical repository of his honour, the instrument of his duty, the silent witness to his life and, perhaps, his death. To create such an object requires far more than technical skill, more than strong arms and a good eye. It requires a clear mind, free of ego. It requires a pure heart, dedicated solely to the perfection of the work, and it requires a deep, abiding respect for the materials drawn from the earth and the transformative power of the fire. The air inside the forge begins to warm as the carefully laid charcoal catches, the fire breathing softly at first, then growing stronger. The charcoal glows, transitioning from a dull red to a vibrant orange, and finally in the heart of the pile a fierce, shimmering white-hot core begins to form. The sounds of the forge begin to awaken, the soft, hungry roar of the flames devouring the charcoal, the rhythmic sigh and push of the bellows, perhaps worked by an apprentice who has undergone his own simpler purification rituals. The day's true work, the intense, demanding, dangerous wrestling with fire and steel, is about to commence. But you take one final moment. You stand before the growing heat, feeling its intense power radiating onto your face, onto your white robes. You breathe in the sharp, clean, almost metallic smell of the burning hardwood charcoal. You close your eyes, centering yourself one last time, feeling the earth solid beneath your feet, feeling the heat before you, hearing the breath of the bellows beside you. You are the conduit. Through you, the raw elements drawn from the mountain will be transformed. Through your sweat, your skill, your spirit poured into the work over many days, a sword will be born. You are the smith, and the ritual has begun. The ritual is complete. The forge is pure. Your mind is clear. Now the true labour begins, the transformation of earth into metal. The heart of the Japanese sword isn't just in its shape or its sharpness, it's in the steel itself. And this steel, Tamahagon or jewel steel, isn't simply melted and poured. It's coaxed into existence through a process so demanding, so boring in its relentless repetition, that it borders on an ordeal. It requires the tatara. Imagine a giant clay bathtub. That's essentially what the tatara furnace looks like. It's a trough-shaped structure built painstakingly by hand from special clay blocks and bricks, often measuring about 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, and perhaps 4 or 5 feet high. Below the main trough runs a complex network of underground tunnels and air pipes, designed to feed a continuous, controlled draft of air to the fire within. This isn't a quick setup. Building a new tatara is a major undertaking, a communal effort that might only happen once a year or even less frequently. The fuel isn't just any wood, it's charcoal, sumi, specifically prepared from certain hardwoods, broken into precise sizes. This isn't for efficiency, it's for purity. Charcoal burns hotter and cleaner than raw wood. introducing fewer impurities into the smelting process. And the ore, this is perhaps the most unique, most boring and most crucial element. You don't use chunks of iron ore dug from the ground, you use satetsu, iron sand, black, heavy sand, painstakingly collected from specific rivers or beaches, often through a laborious process of washing and magnetic separation. This sand is naturally rich in iron oxide, but also relatively low in phosphorus and sulfur, impurities that would make the resulting steel brittle and useless for a sword. Gathering enough high-quality satetsu for a single smelt can take weeks, months even, of back-breaking work by many people. The process of running the tatara is called the tatara fuki. It's not a job for one person. It requires a team working in shifts around the clock, led by a master smelter known as the Mirage. The Mirage is a figure of immense experience and intuition. He doesn't rely on thermometers or chemical analysis. He reads the colour of the flames, the sound of the furnace, the smell of the smoke, the subtle shifts in temperature felt on his skin. His word is law. The operation begins slowly. The tatara is carefully preheated over several hours. Then, the first layers of charcoal are added and ignited. Once the fire is roaring, the cycle begins. A layer of charcoal, then a layer of the precious iron sand carefully sprinkled over the top, then more charcoal, then more iron sand, hour after hour, day after day. This isn't a passive process. The furnace demands constant attention. Teams of assistants work the bellows, giant hand-pumped or foot-operated contraptions that force air through the underground pipes and into the heart of the fire, feeding the combustion. The sound is relentless. The rhythmic whoosh and clack of the bellows, the deep, hungry roar of the fire within the clay walls, the crackle of the consuming charcoal. The heat is immense, radiating outwards, making the air in the forge hut thick and almost unbreathable, even in the dead of winter. Sweat pours off the workers. The Mirage watches intently, occasionally peering through small openings in the clay walls, judging the state of the smelt by the colour and intensity of the inferno. Is it hot enough? Too hot? Is the air flowing correctly? He directs his team, ordering more charcoal, more sand, adjustments to the bellows rhythm. This cycle continues, unbroken, for 3 days and 3 nights, 72 hours. There is no stopping. Teams work in shifts, sleeping in brief, exhausted snatches nearby, but the furnace itself never rests. The Mirage often stays awake for almost the entire duration, his senses stretched thin, monitoring the delicate chemical ballet happening inside the clay womb. What's happening inside? It's not simply melting. The temperature inside the tatara reaches around 1,400 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt iron. But the goal isn't liquid metal. The goal is a slow, boring process of reduction. The burning charcoal produces carbon monoxide gas. This gas reacts with the iron oxide in the satetsu, stripping away the oxygen atoms and leaving behind particles of relatively pure iron. At the same time, the iron absorbs carbon from the charcoal itself. Because the temperature and airflow vary slightly throughout the massive furnace, different parts of the smelt absorb different amounts of carbon. Some areas become high-carbon steel, hard and brittle. Some become low-carbon steel or even wrought iron, soft and tough. It's an intentionally imperfect process, creating a non-homogeneous mass of metal with varying carbon content. After 3 days and nights of relentless feeding and tending, the Mirage finally declares the smelt complete. The bellows fall silent. The roar of the fire begins to subside. But the work is far from over. Now comes the most dramatic and dangerous part, breaking open the furnace. Teams of workers, shielded from the still intense heat, use long iron bars and brute force to smash away a section of the tatara's clay wall. Inside, nestled in the bed of glowing embers and slag, lies the fruit of their labour, the kira. The kira is not a neat ingot. It's a monstrous, uneven, sponge-like bloom of raw steel, weighing several tons. It's a chaotic mixture of high-carbon steel, low-carbon steel, wrought iron, slag, and unreduced ore, all fused together in a semi-molten state. It glows with residual heat, radiating waves of warmth through the now quiet forge. Extracting this beast from the furnace is a Herculean task, requiring levers, chains, and the coordinated effort of many strong backs. Once pulled free, the massive kira sits on the forge floor, slowly cooling, cracking and groaning under its own weight. Now begins the boring, meticulous and absolutely critical task of sorting. Once the kira is cool enough to handle, which can take hours, even days, the Mirage and experienced smiths begin the process of breaking it apart. Using heavy hammers, they carefully shatter the bloom into smaller chunks. This isn't random smashing. They are listening to the sound of the hammer blows, looking at the fracture patterns, judging the colour and texture of the broken surfaces. They are reading the metal. With years of experience, they can distinguish the different grades of steel by eye and feel. The best pieces, the high-carbon steel with a bright crystalline fracture, often found near the top and centre of the kira, are set aside. This is the precious tamahagan, the jewel steel. It might make up only a fraction of the total weight of the kira. Other pieces, lower carbon steel, wrought iron, are sorted into different piles. Even the slag is examined, as its colour and consistency tell the mirage about the success of the smelt. Nothing is wasted, but only the tamahagan is deemed worthy of becoming the edge of a sword. This sorting process is slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Each piece is scrutinised. Is the carbon content right? Are there too many visible impurities? Is the grain structure sound? A mistake here, choosing a flawed piece of tamahagan, could doom the finished sword, causing it to fail months or even years later during the final quench, or worse, in the hands of its owner. At the end of this long, exhausting cycle, the preparation, the 72-hour smelt, the breaking of the furnace, the sorting of the kira, you're left with maybe a few £100 of usable tamahagan, small, irregular, dull, grey chunks of high-carbon steel. It doesn't look like much, it looks like rubble. But this rubble, born from iron, sand and charcoal, from fire and air, from sleepless vigilance and generations of boring, hard-won knowledge, this is the raw material of legends. This is the steel from which you, the smith, will forge the soul of the samurai. The next stage, the transformation of these rough jewels into a blade, requires a different kind of fire, a different kind of rhythm, and the most crucial secret of all. You stand before the hearth, the hodo. The tatara has done its monumental work, transforming raw, dark iron sand into irregular chunks of precious tamahagan. But this steel, this jewel steel, despite its name, is still rough, inconsistent, riddled with pockets of slag and varying levels of carbon. It holds immense potential, but it is far from ready to become a blade. Your task now, as the kaji, the smith, is to purify it, homogenize it, shape it, and ultimately imbue it with the paradoxical qualities that define the Japanese sword. This is where the true artistry, the relentless physical labour, and the most famous, often mythologized secret of the Japanese sword truly lies: the fold, the construction, and the transformative power of fire and water. You begin by selecting the best pieces of tamahagan delivered from the tatara master, the Mirage. Your experienced eye judges them not just by size but by their weight in your hand, their dull grey texture, the specific crystalline pattern revealed where they were fractured from the main kira bloom. You're looking for steel with the right carbon content, likely between 0.8% and 1.5% at this raw stage, destined for the blade's edge. You heat these rough, uneven chunks in the deep charcoal fire of your hearth. The bellows sigh rhythmically, feeding air to the coals, bringing the temperature up until the metal pieces glow a bright, almost luminous orange-yellow, becoming soft and malleable, yielding almost like thick molten taffy. Using long, heavy tongs, the yatako, you carefully retrieve a glowing piece and place it onto the massive, solid face of the anvil, the kanatoko. Now begins the defining rhythm of the Japanese forge, the thud, thud, thud of the hammer. This is not the brute force smashing used to break the kira. This is controlled violence, a precise percussive conversation between you, the hammer, and the steel. Guided by years of practice, you hammer the glowing chunk flat, drawing it out into a rough rectangular bar. With each blow, brilliant sparks fly like tiny short-lived stars exploding in the dim forge light, carrying away visible impurities, bits of slag spat out from the compressed metal. You watch the colour of the steel with unwavering intensity. If it cools too much, turning a dull red, it will resist the hammer, becoming stubborn, possibly developing microcracks under the impact. If it gets too hot, reaching a near-white incandescence, you risk burning out the precious carbon that is essential for the steel's hardness, rendering it useless. Finding and maintaining that perfect orange-yellow working heat is a constant intuitive dance. Once the initial chunk is flattened into a bar, perhaps an inch thick, you use a chisel or the sharp edge of your hammer to score it deeply across its width, about halfway through. Then, using your tongs, you carefully fold the bar back onto itself, end to end, like closing a book. Now the real work starts. The process that truly defines this steel. You heat the folded bar again, this time taking it to a higher temperature, a near-white heat, where the surfaces of the steel become sticky, almost liquid, ready to fuse. Just before removing it from the fire, you sprinkle a mixture of straw ash and fine clay mud onto the seam where the two halves meet. This acts as a flux, a cleaning agent. As it melts, it helps dissolve remaining oxides on the surfaces, ensuring a clean, strong bond, and it forms a temporary barrier, preventing oxygen from the air from getting trapped between the layers during the weld, which would create a disastrously weak spot, a hidden void within the steel. Back onto the anvil. The hammering resumes, but with a different intensity now, a different purpose. You're not just shaping, you are welding. Your initial blows must be firm, authoritative, driving the two layers together with enough force that they fuse, becoming one seamless, monolithic piece of steel again. You listen to the sound of the hammer. A solid, ringing impact indicates a good weld. A dull thud might suggest a flaw. Once welded, you begin hammering it flat again, drawing it out along its length, elongating the bar back to roughly its original dimensions before the fold. Then, you do it again. Score the bar across its width. Fold it carefully, ensuring the new seam aligns. Flux the joint with ash and clay. Heat it to welding temperature. Weld the layers with decisive hammer blows. Draw the bar out flat again, feeling the steel respond, becoming denser, more uniform under your control. And again, and again, and again. This is the fold. The process your short script mentioned, the technique whispered about in legends, the source of much mystique. How many times? Tradition often romanticizes it, speaking of thousands or even millions of layers. The mathematical reality is that each fold doubles the number of internal layers. One fold gives 2 layers, 2 folds give 4, 10 folds give 8 layers, 1,024, 15 folds give 32,768, 20 folds give over 1 million. While impressive, the actual number of folds performed by master smiths is more practical, more boring, dictated by function rather than fantasy. Typically you will fold the steel between 8 and perhaps 16 times. Often, around 12 to 15 folds is considered optimal for the steel destined for the sharpest edge. Why undertake this incredibly laborious, time-consuming and fuel-intensive process? It serves multiple crucial purposes, each essential to transforming the raw, inconsistent Tammerhagen into sword-quality steel. First, purification. The raw steel bloom is riddled with non-metallic inclusions, slag, bits of silica, remnants from the smelting process. Each time you heat the steel to welding temperature, hammer it, and fold it, more of these brittle impurities are physically squeezed out, fractured or vaporized and carried away in the flying sparks. You are literally beating the dross out of the metal. Second, homogenization. The Tammerhagen inherently has inconsistent carbon content throughout the chunks. Folding and welding acts like kneading dough. It mixes the steel intimately, distributing the carbon atoms much more evenly throughout the bar. This eliminates hard and soft spots, creating a more uniform and reliable material, crucial for predictable performance in the final blade. Third, refinement of the grain structure. While not creating distinct visual layers like pattern-welded Damascus steel, the repeated process of heating, hammering and folding breaks down the coarse crystal structure of the raw steel, creating a finer, more tightly interwoven grain. This finer grain structure significantly increases the steel's toughness and resilience, making it less prone to fracture. The work is hypnotic in its repetition, yet demands constant vigilance. It is utterly exhausting. The thud, thud, thud of the hammer becomes the unwavering pulse of the forge, a sound that echoes in your ears long after the work stops. You lose track of time, measuring progress only by the number of folds completed, marked perhaps by small chalk lines on the forge wall. Hours melt into days. Your arms burn with fatigue, your shoulders ache, your back protests. Sweat stings your eyes, blurring your vision momentarily before you blink it away. the heat from the hearth is a constant oppressive presence, baking the air, making every breath feel heavy. You learn to rely on instinct, honed over years, perhaps decades, of practice. You judge the heat by the precise shade of glowing orange-yellow, reading the subtle language of the steel. You feel the metal's response under the hammer. Is it yielding smoothly, or is it resisting, hinting at a cold spot or an impending crack? You listen to the sound of the impact, distinguishing the clear ring of solid steel from the dull thud of a potential flaw. You're not merely beating metal, you're reading it, listening to it, coaxing it towards perfection. Too few folds and impurities will remain. The carbon distribution will be uneven, leaving weak points. Too many folds and you risk hammering out too much of the vital carbon, making the steel too soft to hold a proper edge. It's a delicate, precarious balance, a tightrope walk learned not from books, but from the feel of the hammer, the smell of the fire, and the memory of past failures. As you meticulously fold the steel destined for the sharp edge, the kawagane, or skin steel, you're carefully managing the carbon content, aiming for a final composition of perhaps 0.6% to 0.7% carbon. This level provides extreme hardness potential, allowing it to achieve that legendary razor sharpness. But you also prepare another block of steel differently. This is the shingane, the coarse steel. For this, you might select lower carbon pieces directly from the kira, steel that naturally contains less carbon. Or you might take some medium carbon tamahagane and deliberately fold it fewer times, perhaps only 6 to 10 times, leaving it less refined but inherently tougher. Sometimes you might even intentionally decarburize it slightly through controlled heating, burning off some of the carbon. This coarse steel needs to be softer, tougher, maybe containing only 0.2% to 0.5% carbon. Its primary role is not cutting, but absorbing the tremendous shock of impact. It needs to bend to flex under stress, not break catastrophically. Now comes the crucial step, the physical embodiment of the paradox that makes the Japanese sword unique, the composite construction. You take the carefully folded, refined bar of hard kawagane and skillfully hammer it into a long U-shaped trough or channel. You take the softer, tougher bar of shingane, forged to the correct dimensions, and fit it precisely inside that U-shaped channel. This is the simplest common construction, known as caboose. Essentially a hard jacket wrapped around a soft core, but you might employ more complex methods depending on the desired qualities of the blade or the traditions of your school. In sanmai construction, you might sandwich the hard-edged steel between softer steel for the sides, hanagen, and spine, munagen. In shihozume, you might use 4 distinct pieces, edge, sides, and spine steel, all meticulously forge-welded together. Each method offers a different balance of edge hardness, overall toughness, and shock absorption, requiring immense skill to execute flawlessly. Assuming the Cobus method, you heat this composite billet, the soft core nestled within its hard skin, carefully and evenly to welding temperature again. Flux, the straw ash and clay mixture, is applied liberally along the seams, and then, with careful, precise, authoritative hammer blows, you forge weld the layers together, coaxing the different steels to fuse into one solid integrated bar. This is perhaps the most demanding welding task. A bad weld here, a hidden air pocket, a microscopic inclusion of slag trapped between the kawagane and shingane. Any tiny flaw will create a fatal weakness, an internal fault line where the blade might delaminate or crack under stress, often during the terrifying stress of the quench itself. Once the composite bar is perfectly welded, the primary shaping of the blade begins. This is called tsunobe, the drawing out process. You repeatedly heat and hammer the bar, gradually stretching it lengthwise, thinning it widthwise, skillfully guiding the metal towards the final elegant form of the sword. With controlled blows, you establish the required length, the graceful taper in width from the base, machi, towards the tip, kisaki, and the subtle distal taper in thickness. You carefully form the primary bevels that will eventually become the edge and establish the distinct ridge lines, shinogi, that define the blade's characteristic cross-section. This shaping process is slow, deliberate, requiring immense concentration and stamina. You might work on only a few inches of the blade at a time, constantly returning it to the fire to maintain the correct working temperature, hammering with controlled force, frequently checking the shape against templates or simply by eye, ensuring the lines flow smoothly, the curves are graceful, the geometry precise. The tip, the kisaki, requires special attention and skill. It's not just the end of the blade, it's a complex transition of bevels and ridge lines that must be shaped perfectly for both effective cutting and resilient thrusting, integrating seamlessly with the main bevels of the blade. Finally, using specialized hammers with carefully shaped faces and perhaps coarse files, yasuri, you refine the shape further, smoothing the surfaces left rough by the forging, perfecting the crispness of the lines, bringing the blade closer to its final dimensions. The blade at this stage is still essentially straight, or may possess only a very slight, almost imperceptible curve induced by the hammering process. It's dull grey, covered in the dark fire scale, kurotsuchi, from repeated heating. It looks lifeless, inert. Now comes the moment of truth, the most critical, most nerve-wracking, most dangerous, and most visually stunning part of the entire creation mythos of the sword, the application of the secret clay mixture, the tsuchioki, and the subsequent water quench, the yakiaya. This is the precise sequence where the blade gains its legendary differential hardness, where its graceful curve is truly born, and where its soul, the visible Haemon, is permanently etched into the steel. This is where months of painstaking labour can be validated in a triumphant success, or utterly destroyed in a single heartbreaking second. You begin by preparing your secret mixture, the yakibatsuchi. Every school, every master smith, guards their own recipe closely, often passing it down orally from master to apprentice through generations. It's fundamentally a refractory slurry, a carefully guarded blend of fine natural clay, polishing stone powder for texture and adherence, charcoal powder to influence carbon activity and potentially prevent decarburization, and water all mixed into a smooth, thick, consistent paste, perhaps the consistency of thick pancake batter. The exact proportions, the specific types of clay and charcoal, are critical and contribute to the unique characteristics of each school's Haemon. Using small, specialized spatulas often made of bamboo, fine brushes, and sometimes just your fingers dipped in the slurry, you begin the meticulous process of painting this insulating clay onto the now perfectly shaped and filed blade. This is not a uniform coating. It requires immense precision and artistry. Along the spine, mun, and the sides of the blade, ji and shinogi-ji, you apply the clay thickly, perhaps several millimeters thick. This substantial layer will act as a blanket, insulating the steel beneath it, causing it to cool relatively slowly during the rapid plunge into the water. But along the edge, the area destined to become lethally hard, you apply the clay much, much thinner, perhaps only a whisper-thin layer, or sometimes even scraping it away in delicate, deliberate patterns using a fine bamboo tool or stylus. The pattern you create in the clay will become the visible Haemon. You might trace a perfectly straight line just above the edge, suguha, requiring incredible control. Or you might create gentle, undulating waves, notere. Perhaps you prefer more active, irregular patterns resembling clouds, gunome, or the outlines of clove blossoms, choji, patterns that are hallmarks of specific schools or smiths. This thin layer, or the absence of clay, will allow the edge portion of the blade to cool extremely rapidly, almost instantaneously when plunged into the water. This carefully orchestrated difference in cooling speed between the thickly coated spine and the thinly coated edge is the entire secret to the Japanese sword's unique properties. The thick clay on the spine ensures it cools slowly enough to form softer, tougher, more flexible steel structures like pearlite or bainite. The thin clay, or lack thereof, on the edge ensures it cools so rapidly that the steel doesn't have time to form those softer structures. Instead, it is forced into the incredibly hard, brittle, needle-like crystal structure known as martensite, the structure required for extreme sharpness and edge retention. The hamon, that beautiful cloudy line you see on a polished blade, is simply the visible boundary, the transition zone, between the hard martensitic edge and the softer pearlite/bainite body and spine. Applying the clay, the tsuchoki, takes hours of intense concentration. You work meticulously, ensuring the thickness is perfectly consistent where it needs to be, that the transition from thick to thin is smooth, that the delicate patterns defining the hamon are precise and aesthetically pleasing according to the traditions of your school. A slight error here, a spot on the edge coated too thickly, a spot on the spine left too thin, an air bubble trapped beneath the clay, can disrupt the cooling process and ruin the quench, causing unwanted soft spots, hard spots, excessive warping, or even catastrophic cracks. Once the clay is applied to your satisfaction, you must let it dry completely, perfectly evenly, perhaps setting it carefully over a very low charcoal fire or simply allowing it to air dry for many hours. Uneven drying can cause the clay to flake off prematurely during the intense heat of the final forging or the shock of the quench. The blade, now coated in its grey, patterned, ceramic-like shell, looks strangely inert, muted, waiting for its fiery baptism. The moment has arrived. The yaki-iya, the water quench. This is the single second, the culmination of potentially months of work that determines success or failure. Everything hangs in the balance. You carefully reheat the clay-coated blade one final time in the long charcoal hearth, moving it slowly back and forth to ensure perfectly even heating. This heating is different from the forging heats. It is slower, more deliberate. You must bring the entire blade from the machi near the tang up to the very tip of the kisaki, precisely and uniformly up to its critical transformation temperature, typically around 750 to 800 degrees Celsius, depending on the steel's carbon content. You judge this temperature not by any mechanical gauge, but by colour alone, peered at intently in the controlled dim light of the forge, often performed just before dawn or well after dusk, when your eyes are most sensitive to the subtle shifts in the steel's incandescent glow. You are looking for a specific luminous shade, often described poetically in transmission texts as the colour of the morning sun rising over the fields, or the soft glow of the harvest moon. Too cool, and the edge will not fully transform into martensite, resulting in a soft, useless blade. Too hot, and the steel's grain structure will grow coarse and large, making the blade excessively brittle, almost certain to crack during the quench or later in use. When the colour is perfect, a shimmering, even radiance along the entire length, you lift the blade smoothly from the fire. There is a moment of intense, almost sacred focus. Absolute silence descends upon the forge, broken only by the soft, hungry roar of the fire. All movement ceases. You hold the glowing blade poised vertically above the trough of water, the mizubune. The water temperature itself is critical, neither too hot nor too cold, sometimes judged by dipping your hand in it, sometimes maintained at a specific temperature passed down through tradition. Then, with a smooth, decisive, unwavering motion, born of countless repetitions, you plunge the blade into the water, edge first or spine first, again depending on the specific techniques and desired outcome dictated by your school's tradition. A sudden, violent eruption of steam explodes upwards, momentarily obscuring the blade. The sound is not a simple hiss, but a deep, sharp sheeing or cheeing, a complex acoustic shockwave as the water flashes instantly into vapour upon contact with the incandescent steel. The feeling vibrates up your arms through the tongs, a brief intense shudder as the metal undergoes its violent transformation. For 1, maybe 2, terrifying seconds, the fate of the blade hangs precariously in the balance. The extreme temperature difference between the glowing steel and the cool water creates immense, almost unimaginable stresses within the metal structure. The thinly coated edge, cooling almost instantaneously, transforms into hard, voluminous martensite and tries to expand dramatically. The thickly coated spine, cooling much more slowly, remains softer, transforms later, and contracts differently. This incredibly rapid differential transformation does 2 crucial things simultaneously, miraculously if all goes well. First, it creates the differential hardness. The edge becomes incredibly hard, potentially exceeding 60 on the Rockwell C scale, capable of taking and holding that legendary, hair-splitting sharpness. The spine and body remain significantly softer, perhaps in the 30s or 40s HRC, retaining their toughness and ability to absorb shock. Second, it physically creates the blade's distinctive curve, the sori. Because the edge expands more, or contracts less later, than the spine during its lightning-fast transformation to martensite, it literally forces the entire blade to bend upwards, away from the edge. The spine effectively compresses or pulls back while the edge pushes out. The blade curves itself, gracefully and permanently, right there in the water. The final degree and style of the curve sori is a result of many factors: the blade's initial geometry, the thickness and pattern of the applied clay, the precise temperatures of the steel and water, and the exact angle and speed of your entry into the quench. You hold the blade submerged for only a few critical seconds, then swiftly pull it out, clouds of steam still rising from its surface, water dripping back into the trough. Instantly, your eyes scan its length in the dim forge light. Did it survive? Sometimes a faint, high-pitched ping sound, almost musical but utterly dreaded, signals the formation of a fatal quench crack, Mizukage. Did it warp excessively, twisting like a serpent? Did the curve form evenly and gracefully, or is it distorted? You hold your breath, examining every inch. If the blade emerges from the water intact, uncracked, and with the desired curve, the hardest, most dangerous part is over. A wave of relief might wash over you, but you cannot relax yet. The blade, especially the newly formed martensitic edge, is now incredibly stressed, at a microscopic level, dangerously brittle like glass. A sharp tap at this stage could shatter it. So you must immediately perform a crucial tempering process to relieve these internal stresses. You gently, carefully reheat the blade again, perhaps holding it high over the charcoal fire, or laying it on a preheated copper block, bringing its temperature up to a much lower level, typically between 150 to 200 degrees Celsius, around 300 to 400 Fahrenheit. You hold it at this gentle heat for a specific period, perhaps an hour or more, allowing some of the tightly packed carbon atoms within the martensite structure to relax slightly, to precipitate out as tiny carbides. This process, yakimodoshi, trades a minuscule, almost imperceptible amount of the absolute peak hardness for a significant increase in toughness and resilience, making the ultra-hard martensitic edge far less prone to chipping or microscopic fracturing in use, without sacrificing its ability to hold a keen edge. Smiths often judge the tempering temperature by watching for specific pale oxide colours, faint straw yellow, golden brown, to appear on a small patch of steel polished clean before tempering. Only now, after the meticulous folding and welding, the patient shaping, the artistic application of the secret clay, the terrifying ordeal of the water quench, and the careful, stress-relieving tempering is the blade truly born. It is still rough, covered in blackened scale and the remnants of the cracked clay coating. But beneath that utilitarian grime lies the hidden potential for greatness. The graceful curve is now permanently set. The differential hardness is locked into the steel structure. The hamon, the soul of the sword, though currently obscured, waits patiently to be revealed through the long, meditative process of polishing. The soul has irrevocably entered the steel. The rest, however laborious, is refinement. The long, painstaking, boring process of polishing, using a succession of progressively finer waterstones over many days or weeks, will slowly grind away the rough exterior, unveil the intricate beauty of the hamon, reveal the subtle layers of the folded steel, Hader, and bring the edge to its final legendary sharpness. But the essential, paradoxical character of the sword, its fusion of extreme hardness and resilient toughness, its elegant curve born from controlled violence, is now complete, forged in the heart of the fire and sealed by the shock of the water. You, the smith, have wrestled with the elements, channeled the kami, and applied generations of accumulated knowledge and skill. And if the spirits were favourable, if your hands were steady, and if your judgment was true, you have won. You've created not just a tool, but a potential masterpiece. Okay, I will now begin part 3.1 of segment 3. Segment 3 of 3, the soul of the samurai. Part 3.1, the katana vs. the tachi, the Mongol invasions. Target word. Count, approximately 1,000 words. I will now write this 1,000 word part, focusing on the historical context and the boring design shift from the tachi to the katana, largely driven by the Mongol invasions and changes in warfare. Part 3.1 of Segment 3. The blade is born. Forged through ritual, purified by folding, hardened by fire and water, imbued with the paradox of a razor edge and a resilient core. The techniques developed during the Heian period, culminating in the elegant tachi, represented a pinnacle of metallurgical achievement. This long, deeply curved sword, worn edge down and wielded primarily from horseback, was the perfect weapon for the classical Bushi warrior. Its design was optimized for the draw and slash from the saddle, a testament to the dominance of mounted archery in the warfare of that era. The Kamakura period, roughly 1185 to 1333, which followed the Heian, is often considered the golden age of sword making, where legendary smiths perfected the tachi form. But warfare, like the steel in the forge, is never static. It adapts, it evolves, and challenges arise that demand new solutions. The elegant tachi, supreme in its intended role, would soon face a trial by fire, quite literally, that would reveal its limitations and ultimately lead to the development of the sword we now recognise as the iconic katana. The catalyst for this shift arrived from across the sea in the late 13th century, the Mongol invasions. In 1274 and again in 1281, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and emperor of the vast Yuan dynasty, launched massive naval expeditions to conquer Japan. These invasions were unlike anything the Japanese warriors had ever faced. The Mongol forces were a disciplined, combined arms military machine. They fought not as individual heroes seeking honour, but as coordinated units employing devastating volleys of arrows, poisoned projectiles and exploding bombs made of paper and iron casings filled with gunpowder, a terrifying novelty to the Japanese. Their armour was also different, often made of hardened leather or layered plates, designed to withstand arrows and slashing blows. The Japanese bushi, accustomed to more ritualised combat, often involving single challenges between mounted archers, were initially thrown into disarray. Their primary weapon, the tachi, faced unexpected challenges against the Mongol equipment and tactics. While beautifully crafted, the elegant, often slender blades of the Kamakura tachi, optimised for cutting softer targets, were reportedly prone to chipping or even breaking when striking the tough leather armour or massed infantry formations of the invaders. The deep curve, perfect for a high slash from horseback, was perhaps less versatile in the chaotic, close-quarters infantry engagements that often characterised the defence against the Mongol landings. Although Japan ultimately repelled both invasions, aided significantly by fortuitous typhoons the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine wind, the experience left a deep scar on the psyche of the warrior class and prompted a re-evaluation of their weapons and tactics. The need for a more robust, versatile sword, suitable for closer combat and potentially better at dealing with tougher armour, became apparent. This military necessity drove the next evolution in sword design, leading away from the tachi and towards the katana. What were the key, boring, practical differences? First, the method of wear. The katana, which became prominent during the Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573, and onwards, was worn thrust through the belt, or obi, with the cutting edge facing up. This seemingly small change had significant implications. Wearing the sword edge up allowed for an even faster draw and cut motion, particularly for a warrior on foot. The swordsman could unsheath the blade and bring the edge to bear in a horizontal or upward cutting motion, almost simultaneously, bypassing the longer upward draw required by the edge-down tachi. This faster deployment reflected a shift towards more infantry-focused combat and surprise encounters, rather than the primarily cavalry engagements of the earlier era. Second, the blade geometry. While still curved, the katana generally featured a shallower sori, curve, compared to the deep sweeps often seen in tachi. The point, the kisaki, also tended to become somewhat shorter and more robust, perhaps better suited for occasional thrusting attacks needed to penetrate gaps in armour, although slashing remained the primary function. The overall length also began to standardise, typically shorter than the grand tachi of the Kamakura period, settling around 60 to 75 centimetres, about 23.5 to 29.5 inches. This slightly shorter, less curved blade was more agile in close quarters and easier to handle effectively by warriors fighting primarily on foot. Third, the construction emphasis, while still based on differential hardening and often lamination, may have subtly shifted. Some historians suggest that swords made after the Mongol invasions tended to be slightly thicker or constructed with techniques emphasising resilience against chipping, perhaps a direct response to the perceived failures against Mongol armour. The Golden Age aesthetics of the Kamakura tachi, with their incredibly fine grain and intricate heiman, perhaps gave way slightly to blades prioritising battlefield robustness during the more turbulent centuries that followed. It's important to note this transition was gradual, not instantaneous. Tachi continued to be made and used for centuries, especially for ceremonial purposes or by high-ranking samurai who still favoured the older, more aristocratic style. Blades were often remounted. A tachi blade might be shortened slightly and fitted with katana mountings, koshirei to be worn edge-up. The distinction became less about the blade itself and more about how it was mounted and worn. Indeed, the signature, miyas, of the smith, traditionally inscribed on the tang, nakago, is typically oriented to face outwards when the sword is worn in its intended style. This is often the clearest way modern experts distinguish between a blade originally intended as a tachi, worn edge down, signature facing away from the body, versus a katana, worn edge up, signature still facing away from the body. But the trend was clear. The challenges of the Mongol invasions, coupled with internal conflicts and the gradual shift towards larger infantry armies, and castle sieges during the Nanboku-cho and Muromachi periods, favoured the katana. It was a more practical, adaptable weapon for the changing face of Japanese warfare. The elegant cavalry sword of the Heian and Kamakura elite slowly gave way to the faster, more versatile blade that would become synonymous with the samurai class. The katana was born not just from artistry, but from the boring, brutal lessons learned on the bloody beaches where the divine wind met the Mongol horde. It was an adaptation, a refinement driven by necessity. The soul was forged in fire, but the final shape was dictated by war. Okay, I will now begin part 3.2 of segment 3. Segment 3 of 3, the soul of the samurai. Part 3.2, the Great Peace, the Daisho Law and Bushido. Target word, count approximately 2,000 words. I will now write this 2,000 word part, focusing on the Edo period when the katana transitioned from a primary weapon of war to a powerful symbol of status and a tool of social control, exploring the boring realities of the Daisho and the philosophical construct of Bushido. Part 3.2 of Segment 3. The katana, forged in the crucible of adaptation following the Mongol invasions and refined through centuries of internal conflict, had become the quintessential weapon of the Japanese warrior. Shorter, slightly less curved than the tachi, and worn edge-up for a faster draw, it was the perfect tool for the tumultuous era of warring states, the Sengoku period, where battles were increasingly fought on foot and life was brutally uncertain. Smiths continued to refine their techniques, producing blades of incredible quality even amidst the chaos. The katana was at the peak of its functional importance, and then the wars stopped. In 1603, after decades of bloody civil war, Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan under his rule, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. This ushered in an unprecedented era of stability and isolation known as the Edo period, a time often called the Great Peace, which would last for over 250 years until 1868. For the samurai class, the bushi, this peace was a problem, a profound, existential, and deeply boring problem. For centuries, their entire identity, their social standing, their reason for being, was tied to warfare. They were the warrior elite. Suddenly, there were no more wars to fight, no more battles for territory, no more opportunities for glory or advancement through martial prowess. The Tokugawa regime enforced a rigid social hierarchy, freezing society in place. Samurai were at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and at the very bottom, merchants. But the samurai's position at the apex was becoming increasingly awkward. They were a military class with no military function. What do you do with hundreds of thousands of highly trained warriors when there is no war? The Tokugawa government found a boring but effective solution: bureaucracy and symbolism. Samurai were largely transformed from active soldiers into administrators, officials and retainers serving their respective daimyo, feudal lords, within the complex structure of the shogunate. They were forced to reside in designated districts within castle towns, physically separated from other social classes. Their lives became governed not by the chaos of the battlefield, but by intricate rules of etiquette, ceremony and protocol, and the katana. It underwent a similar transformation. It ceased to be primarily a tool of war and became, overwhelmingly, a symbol, a badge of rank, an indicator of status, the most potent visual signifier of belonging to the elite samurai class. This symbolic function was cemented by law. One of the most defining regulations of the Edo period was the requirement for samurai to wear two swords, known as the daisho, literally meaning big little. This pair consisted of the long sword, the katana, the dai, or big sword, and a shorter companion sword, the wakizashi, the sho, or little sword. This wasn't merely a fashion statement, it was a legal mandate. only members of the samurai class were permitted to wear the daisho. Peasants, artisans, merchants, they were forbidden from wearing swords, particularly the katana. This law, rigorously enforced, created an immediate and unmistakable visual distinction. Seeing a man wearing two swords instantly identified him as a samurai, entitled to certain privileges and bound by certain obligations. The boring reality of the daisho is that, for most samurai during the long peace, these swords were rarely if ever drawn in anger. Duels still occurred, but they were often highly ritualized or officially sanctioned affairs, not the common street brawls of earlier eras. Wearing the swords became an end in itself. It was about displaying one's hereditary right to violence, even in, perhaps especially in, a time when that violence was largely suppressed. Think about the daily life of an Edo period samurai. You wake up, you dress in formal robes, the kamishimo perhaps, with its stiff wing-like shoulders, and you strap on your daisho. Not because you expect to fight bandits on your way to the castle, but because it is required. It is part of your uniform, part of your identity. You might spend your day doing paperwork, attending tedious meetings, practicing calligraphy, or studying Confucian classics. Your swords, heavy at your hip, are a constant reminder of who you are, or perhaps who your ancestors were. The care of these swords became an elaborate ritual in itself, polishing the blades, oiling them to prevent rust, maintaining the intricate fittings, koshirai, the lacquered scabbard, saya, the silk wrapping on the hilt, tsukaito, the decorative guard, tsuba, became a way to connect with the martial heritage even in the absence of actual combat. The sword wasn't just worn, it was curated, maintained, almost worshipped as a sacred object embodying the samurai spirit. But what was that spirit in an age of peace? This is where another crucial, boring, and largely philosophical development of the Edo period comes in, the codification of Bushido, the way of the warrior. While the core principles of loyalty, discipline, and honor had existed among the warrior class for centuries, it was during the Tokugawa peace that these ideas were formalized, written down, and transformed into a comprehensive ethical and moral code. Thinkers like Yamaga in the 17th century began to articulate what it meant to be a samurai when there was no war. If a samurai wasn't fighting, what was his purpose? Bushido provided the answer. It wasn't just about martial skill anymore, it was about moral cultivation. It emphasized virtues heavily influenced by Confucianism, absolute loyalty to one's master, daimyo, filial piety, self-discipline, frugality, honesty, benevolence, and maintaining one's honor above all else, even life itself. The ideal samurai was not just a killer, but a scholar, an administrator, a moral exemplar for the lower classes. This philosophy served a crucial political purpose for the Tokugawa shogunate. It helped to channel the restless energy of the samurai class away from potential rebellion and towards internal discipline and service to the existing power structure. By emphasizing loyalty and obedience as the highest virtues, Bushido helped ensure the stability of the regime. It gave the samurai a new role, not just warriors, but moral guardians of society. The katana became the physical embodiment of these abstract principles. It represented the samurai's readiness to enforce justice as defined by the state, his commitment to honor, and his willingness to sacrifice his life for his lord. The act of wearing the sword, even if it was never drawn, became a constant silent performance of Bushido. The boring truth is that Bushido, as a formalized code, was largely an invention of peacetime. It romanticized a past era of warfare while providing a framework for the samurai's new, less violent, and often far more mundane existence. It was a way to maintain the identity and privileges of the warrior class in a world that no longer strictly needed warriors. Of course, the reality for many samurai was far less noble than the ideals of Bushido. Especially for lower-ranking samurai, the Edo period could be one of stifling poverty and frustration. Paid in fixed stipends of rice, their economic status often declined relative to the rising merchant class, whom they officially despised but often relied upon for loans. Trapped in a rigid hierarchy with little chance of advancement, forbidden from engaging in commerce, many samurai struggled to maintain the appearances required by their rank. Their prized swords, symbols of their elite status, sometimes ended up pawned to moneylenders. Yet, the symbol endured. The daisho, the two swords worn edge-up, remained the undeniable mark of the samurai until the very end of the Edo period. It was a constant visual reminder of the strict social order, of the Tokugawa peace enforced by a warrior class whose primary weapon had become a symbol of a past they could no longer practice, and a philosophy designed to keep them useful, or at least compliant, in an era defined by its boring, enduring stability. The katana, once forged for the chaos of war, now served the rigid order of peace, its keen edge reflecting not the fire of battle, but the complex, often contradictory soul of the samurai class itself. It waited, silent in its scabbard, for a future that might call upon its sharpness once more, or perhaps for a final, mysterious disappearance. Okay, I will now begin part 3.3 of segment 3. Segment 3 of 3. The Soul of the Samurai. Part 3.3, The Lost Sword, the Honjo Masamune. Target word, count, approximately 2,000 words. I will now write this 2,000 word part, focusing on the history, significance, and mysterious disappearance of the Honjo Masamune, often considered the greatest Japanese sword ever made. Part 3.3 of segment 3. The Edo period, the Great Peace, solidified the katana's role as a symbol, a badge of rank worn by a largely administrative warrior class. The Daisho, the pair of swords, became the defining mark of the samurai, governed by strict laws and steeped in the newly formalized philosophy of Bushido. Swords were still made, often with incredible artistry, but they rarely tasted battle. They became heirlooms, objects of veneration, repositories of family honour and increasingly of national history, and among all the countless blades forged over the centuries, one sword rose above the rest to become the ultimate symbol, not just of the samurai, but of the Japanese nation itself, a blade so famous, so revered, and ultimately so tragically lost, that its story feels like a boring, historical cold case file, still open after nearly 80 years. This is the story of the Honjo Masamune. To understand the significance of this particular sword, you first need to understand the name Masamune. Goro Nudo. Masamune is widely regarded as Japan's greatest swordsmith, the undisputed master of the craft. He works during the late Kamakura period, likely around the early 14th century in Sagami province. This was the golden age of swordmaking, a time when the techniques of folding, differential hardening, and blade geometry reached an apex of sophistication. Masamune's blades were legendary even in his own time, known for their flawless construction, their incredible resilience, and most famously, their breathtakingly beautiful hamen, temper lines, and harder grain pattern in the steel. His hamen often displayed any bright individual martensite crystals visible to the naked eye, shimmering along the edge like stars or frost, a hallmark of his incredible skill in controlling the quench. Masamune supposedly trained many famous smiths, creating a legacy that influenced sword-making for centuries. Owning a blade attributed to Masamune was the ultimate status symbol for any daimyo or high-ranking samurai. His swords were not just weapons, they were considered national treasures almost from the moment they were made, and among all the blades attributed to Masamune, one stood out as his masterpiece, the Honjo Masamune. The boring history of this sword is in itself a chronicle of power and conflict in feudal Japan. Its story, as far as we can trace it, begins in the turbulent Sengoku period, the age of warring states that preceded the Tokugawa peace. The sword first gained prominence in the hands of Honjo Shigenaga, a general serving the Yasugi clan in the 16th century. The story goes that Shigenaga was attacked by an enemy general who wielded the Masamune blade. During the fierce battle, the Masamune sword supposedly split Shigenaga's helmet, but Shigenaga survived and eventually claimed the sword as a prize. However, Shigenaga later found himself in financial difficulty. Around 1595, he was forced to sell the precious blade. He sold it to Toyotomi Hidetsugu, the nephew and adopted son of the great unifier Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The price: a boring specific sum, 13 mai, 13 large gold coins. A fortune, but likely far less than the sword's true worth. From Hidetsugu, the sword's journey becomes a boring but crucial paper trail through the highest echelons of power. After Hidetsugu fell out of favour and was forced to commit seppuku, the blade passed likely through Toyotomi Hideyoshi himself, and eventually found its way into the hands of the man who would finally end the wars and establish the long peace, Tokugawa Ieyasu. For the Tokugawa shogunate, the Honjo Masamune became more than just a famous sword. It became a symbol of their legitimacy, their power, their dynasty. It was passed down through the generations of Tokugawa shoguns, carefully preserved, revered as one of the most important treasures of the ruling family. It represented the pinnacle of the warrior culture that the Tokugawa now controlled and embodied. Owning the Honjo Masamune was like owning the crown jewels. For over 2.5 centuries during the entire Edo period, the sword remained in the secure possession of the Tokugawa clan. It was likely brought out only on rare ceremonial occasions, its legendary beauty admired by those few privileged enough to see it. It survived the decline of the samurai class, the Meiji Restoration in 1868, when the shogunate fell and imperial rule was restored, and the tumultuous modernization of Japan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By the 1930s, the Honjo Masamune was still held by the Tokugawa family, specifically by Count Tokugawa Ieyasu, the head of the main family line. In 1939, recognizing its immense cultural and historical importance, the Japanese government designated the Honjo Masamune as a kokuho, a national treasure of Japan. This was the highest possible designation, reserved for artifacts deemed essential to the nation's heritage. The sword was no longer just a Tokugawa heirloom, it was officially recognized as belonging to the history of all Japan. Then came World War II. Following Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Allied occupation forces, led by the United States, implemented sweeping reforms aimed at demilitarizing the country and dismantling the old feudal structures and ideologies. One of these directives, issued in September 1945, required all Japanese citizens, including former nobles and samurai families, to surrender any swords they possessed. The goal was disarmament, preventing any potential resurgence of militarism. This order created immense anxiety among collectors, historians, and families who owned culturally significant blades. While intended to collect weapons of war, the directive initially made little distinction between functional military gunto, mass-produced officer swords, and priceless works of art like the Honjo Masamune. Count Tokugawa Ieyasu, faced with this directive, made a difficult decision. In December 1945, wanting to set an example and comply with the law, he gathered the Honjo Masamune along with 14 other treasured swords from the Tokugawa family collection. He took them not to a military depot, but to a local police station in Mijiro, Tokyo. The boring, bureaucratic detail is crucial here. He surrendered these national treasures, including the most famous sword in Japanese history, to the civilian police, likely hoping they would be treated with care and eventually preserved. The Mijiro police documented the handover, the swords were recorded, and then they vanished. What happened next is a frustrating, boring bureaucratic mystery shrouded in the chaos of post-war Japan. The standard procedure, supposedly, was for surrendered swords collected by local police to be transferred to the custody of the occupying Allied forces, specifically the US 8th Army, for disposal or, in some cases, for preservation, if deemed culturally significant, though this distinction was often poorly understood or implemented in the early days. The Honjo Masamune, along with the other Tokugawa swords, likely left the Meijiro police station in January 1946, but where did it go? The most common and most accepted story is that the swords were handed over to a US Army soldier, possibly of the 7th Cavalry, who was stationed in the area and tasked with collecting surrendered weapons. The name often associated with this handover, though its veracity is debated, is Sergeant Coldy Bymore, a name that sounds suspiciously like a phonetic misunderstanding or misrecording of an American name. Records from the time are incomplete, chaotic, and often contradictory. Did this soldier recognize the significance of the blade he was taking? Almost certainly not. To most American GIs tasked with collecting piles of surrendered samurai swords, they were just war souvenirs. Some were kept, some were distributed, some were likely destroyed or dumped at sea. There was little systematic effort in those early months to differentiate between priceless antiques and mass-produced military hardware, and so, the Honjo Masamune, a designated national treasure, the masterpiece of Japan's greatest swordsmith, the symbol of the Tokugawa shogunate, simply disappeared into the vast disorganized bureaucracy of the Allied occupation. Was it taken back to the United States as a souvenir by Sergeant Bymore or another soldier? This is the most widely held theory. If so, does it now sit unrecognized in an attic somewhere? Did its owner pass away, leaving it to heirs who have no idea of its historical significance? Was it eventually sold, its identity lost, perhaps remounted or even altered? Could it have been destroyed? It's possible, though heartbreaking to consider, that it was simply lumped in with thousands of other swords and dumped into Tokyo Bay or melted down. Could it still be in Japan? Some theories suggest it might have been secretly saved or diverted by Japanese officials or individuals who recognised its importance. Though there is no evidence to support this, the search has never stopped. For decades, Japanese sword organisations, historians, and government agencies have followed leads, investigated claims, and hoped for its reappearance. Notices have been circulated internationally. Museums and collectors worldwide remain vigilant. Every few years, a rumour surfaces. A sword resembling the Masamune appears at auction. A family claims to have inherited it, but so far, none have proven to be the genuine Honjo Masamune. The loss is incalculable. We have detailed records, oshigata, rubbings or drawings, documenting its characteristics, its length, its unique hamon pattern, the notches and features that told its history. But the sword itself, the physical object, the embodiment of centuries of Japanese history and artistry, remains lost. The story of the Honjo Masamune is a boring tragedy of bureaucracy, cultural misunderstanding, and the chaos of war's aftermath. It's a reminder that even the most revered objects, symbols imbued with immense meaning, can vanish not in a clash of steel, but in the shuffle of paperwork, the ignorance of a moment, the vast indifference of history. The greatest katana ever made, the soul of the shogunate, wasn't shattered in battle. It was misplaced, and it waits, perhaps somewhere quiet, perhaps somewhere mundane, perhaps forever lost, a final, silent mystery in the long and storied history of the Japanese sword. And so, the story of the katana comes full circle, from a brittle iron poker, useless on horseback, to the elegant tachi born of necessity and legend, from the sacred fire of the forge, folded and quenched into paradoxical perfection, to the iconic blade worn edge-up by the samurai, and finally from a tool of war to a symbol of peace, status and philosophy, culminating in the mystery of a lost masterpiece. The katana is more than just a sword. It's a reflection of history, artistry, spirituality, and the enduring human quest for perfection, even in the most boring, painstaking details. It's a story forged in steel, written in the subtle lines of the hamon, and carried through centuries. Thank you for joining us on this long journey through the history of the katana. If you found this exploration relaxing, or perhaps even learned something interesting along the way, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to uncover these quiet corners of the past. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, and your dreams filled with the gentle echoes of history.